We're about to do some battle.
One of these players has very bad penmanship, but that person will remain nameless.
For now.
Yeah, for now. I'm looking at you, Sam Roukas.
Again, so we've got 2 copies of Monastery Mentor in Sam's main deck, which is something that started to pick up as a way to combat the mirror and to have some great game against the Omnitel decks, but kind of fell to the wayside as Dig Through Time got banned and the mirror turned out to be not so grindy. Sam's going to go ahead and lead off here with an Island and a Sensei's Divining Top. Andy Ferguson is going to have a Mox Opal, a Vault of Whispers. He's going to cast a Vault Scourge, losing 2 life for the Phyrexian mana, which will turn on his Mox Opal. And then he's going to go ahead and cast a Signal Pest. So we've got 4 permanents have entered the battlefield for Andy Ferguson on his first turn.
Yeah, pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Pretty good start. I would have even given him the advantage a little earlier than that. I mean, he showed up to the match with a leather jacket. And we all know that in the feature match area, the leather jackets don't lose.
So Sam is going to go ahead and top in his upkeep. He's just going to play an Arid Mesa and pass the turn back. Andy's going to go ahead and attack using the Battle Cry to get in for 2 points of damage there with his Vault Scourge. And let's see what else we've got going on.
So it'll be pretty interesting to see how Andy paces his threats. He's seen Sensei's Divining Top on turn 1, so he can make a pretty educated guess that he's up against Miracles, and he has to worry about a Terminus.
Speak of the devil.
Speak of the devil.
Sam is going to go ahead and reveal a Terminus for his draw step. With the Miracle trigger on the stack, he's going to go ahead and use his Arid Mesa, go down to 17, go down to 17, get a Tempest Plains, and cast that Terminus. He's just going to play a Misty Rainforest and pass back to Andy Ferguson. Now his Mox Opal is still turned on, so if he has another land here, he could potentially play a Tezzeret, but he's just going to go ahead and use a Thoughtcast, 1 mana, draw 2 cards, refill his hand.
So that Terminus was a full 3-for-1, and now Andy's able to recoup a little bit of that loss with Thoughtcast being a 2-for-1. And now he's basically back to even, but he would certainly like to have a bit more pressure on the board, so we'll see what he can develop.
It's like he was able to find a copy of Tezzeret there. He doesn't have another land, it seems. Now, just peeking at Sam's hand as he flicks through, it looks like there is a Monastery Mentor, so that has the potential to generate a lot of tokens with Sensei's Divining Top.
Yeah, the one thing that's a little interesting is the Affinity deck has a fair amount of flying threats. So one of the good things about Monastery Mentor and the Miracles deck is not only that it's a good clock, but usually that it can play a fair bit of defense also. In this particular case, though, I don't think the Mentor is going to be playing defense that well. It may be enough counter pressure to end the game, though. It is a very powerful card.
So Sam is going to go ahead and use his Misty Rainforest there on Andy's end step. Get another look at the top 3 with his Sensei's Divining Top. There is a Swords to Plowshares and another land.
I feel like with that early Terminus, that was exactly what Sam Roukas needed to make sure that Andy Ferguson didn't do anything too explosive. And now that we are starting to head into the mid-game, it's going to be more likely that Sam Roukas is able to answer most of what Andy Ferguson does.
Now, one of the sweet things here about having these artifact lands is Andy Ferguson is going to be able to move this Cranial Plating at will with that 2 black mana. So when he attacks here with both of his creatures, he is just going to be able to move that Cranial Plating over. Swords to Plowshares is going to take care of that Ornithopter before it gets equipped, so Andy's not going to gain any life from it, but he's now just going to be able to re-equip and have a pretty decent threat there on the battlefield.
Yeah, if he wants to play his Agent, though, I think that's going to use up all of his mana, and to just equip an attack for, would that be 7? You know, that's pretty decent, but it doesn't use his mana particularly efficiently.
If he has another artifact that he can put on the battlefield and make it 8, that's just going to do half of Sam's life.
Yeah, it almost looked like he had a Thoughtcast in his hand, but I'm not 100% sure. It'll be interesting to see what Andy decides to do.
Now, Sam does have 2 Force of Wills in his hand, so Andy does have to calculate if he invests all of this mana in trying to play this Tezzeret, and Sam happens to have a Force of Will, not only is he going to get another Monk from this Monastery Mentor, which will shorten the clock for Sam, but it's going to use up almost his entire turn.
Yeah, the other thing, too, about playing the Agent is it's so likely to just die. Like on the following turn by an attack from Sam.
So Andy's going to go ahead and equip Cranial Plate into the Ornithopter. That is going to make it a 7-2.
Pretty big Ornithopter. Dude, that Ornithopter's on roids.
Yeah, he's been working out. He's been hanging out at the Tarmogoyf gym.
Yeah.
So Andy's going to go ahead and attack for 7. It's going to knock Sam down to 9. But Sam's going to get to untap with a Divining Top and a Monastery Mentor. So he's going to go ahead and use his top. Oh, and there's a Plow and a Counterbalance. So Sam's going to go ahead and do this little dance where every turn he's going to be topping and then drawing a card with his top. That way he gets to recast the top, triggers the Monastery Mentor and the Monk. So not only does it make an additional Monk, but it also gives him a Prowess trigger. So this is going to be an attack for 7.
Yeah, and we can see how Sam Roukas' deck is really set up to beat creatures. And Andy Ferguson, he had an explosive start, which is how he gets an edge in the matchup. But Sam Roukas, with that early Terminus, was really able to take away Andy Ferguson's edge in the matchup. And now that we're in the mid-game, approaching the late game, Sam Roukas is just doing things that are a lot more powerful. Andy was setting himself up to potentially kill Sam on the following turn, but Sam just seems to just have the answers.
So Andy's going to go ahead and play this Tezzeret, and that's going to prompt a Force of Will from Sam. He's going to get another Monk. He's going to be able to use the top in his upkeep, draw a card with the top, redraw the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So he's at least going to be able to do 11 damage just from casting Sensei's Divining Top.
Yeah, that is pretty good. And this is really showcasing the power of Monastery Mentor. It was a 3-mana investment, and now it's potentially attacking for 11, you said? Yeah, 11. That is quite good. So it's basically 6 power and toughness on the board, and then 5 power and toughness from prowess triggers. That is pretty nice.
So Sam does have 2 lands and a Counterbalance in the top cards on his library. So let's see how he decides to play this. So he's just going to draw in his upkeep, draw the top for his turn. He's going to fetch. He's going to play the top, make a Monk. Is he going to top first to see if there's a spell for the unknown? There is a Ponder. Ooh, that's a good one.
Oh, yeah.
So he's going to draw
There's
the
going to be
Ponder.
a lot of damage coming through.
Yeah, and a lot of Monks.
It is possible for Andy to win on his turn, though. He can just equip the Signal Pest, attack, and then play Tezzeret and finish him off, right?
Well, he would have to play. He could play the Tezzeret, make the Signal Pest a 5/5, and then equip the Cranial Plating. You have to get 1/1 out of Tezzeret to ultimate it, right?
Okay, got it. So despite Sam seeming to have Andy's board under control, Andy may have what he needs to squeeze in the last bit of damage. Right now they're figuring out how much damage is being dealt here. I believe that this is 16 damage.
I feel like Andy is just like, is it less than 20?
Yeah.
All right, that's enough.
Oh, he's chump blocking.
Why are you?
So there was the top, and there was the Ponder.
Was that a lethal attack?
Maybe we missed a prowess trigger in there, and it was actually 21 damage.
Oh, man.
Yeah, pretty rough.
Well, if that wasn't lethal, then Andy would have had the win on the crackback.
Yeah, it must have been lethal damage. We had just missed a prowess trigger. At least that's what I assume. Either way, though, Sam Roukas does his miracle thing and is able to keep control over the board and then win with just a single powerful threat.
So Sam's going to go ahead and take game 1 with his Miracles deck against Andy Ferguson, who is on Affinity. Let's go ahead and take a look at their sideboards and see what kind of options these players have against each other. Sam has 3 copies of Flusterstorm, 2 Vendean Click, 2 Red Elemental Blast, 2 Pyroblast, 2 Rest in Peace, 2 copies of Wear and Tear, an Is It Staticaster, and an Entreat the Angels. What do you think Sam's going to do?
So Sam didn't see the Tezzeret. If he knows that Andy is playing Tezzeret, it seems pretty reasonable to bring in probably not all, but maybe some of the Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast because they also hit Thoughtcast. But even if he knew that they were in there, he may only bring in 1 or 2 of those. The cards that are definitely going to be good in the matchup are the 2 Wear Tears and the Is It Staticaster. Is It Staticaster,
yeah.
similar to Modern, it's really good against Affinity. And then he may just want to bring in Treat the Angels. The Affinity deck, it attacks in the air a lot, and Sam doesn't have much that blocks in the air. He could bring in Vendean Click for that reason, but I don't think he will. So Entreat, though, seems like a reasonable option.
So Andy has 4 Chalice of the Void, 2 Ethersworn Canonist, or 4 Canonists, 3 Rest in Peace, 2 Thoughtseize, 1 Tezzeret, 1 Jite. What do you think he's going to bring in?
So Andy Ferguson's deck, like a lot of aggro decks, is very, very streamlined. He really doesn't have much interaction because he really doesn't want to interact very much. I think that he might bring in maybe the 2 Thoughtseizes. They can discard is generally something that people like against control decks, although I could see Andy not bringing in the Thoughtseize and really only wanting them for control decks. He could also bring in Tezzeret. Tezzeret is something that's going to give his aggression a bit more staying power on the board. It can also be a little tricky for Sam to counter with counterbalance because Sam's deck doesn't have a lot of 4s. So I think that the Tezzeret is probably going to bring in the Thoughtseizes maybe, and I don't think the other cards will be brought in.
Well, that definitely sounds good to me. I like this Affinity deck. Man, I'm going to go back myself later on, when I get a chance to count up that attack, because if it's not lethal, Andy definitely had a win on the crackback. Andy has been doing very well in our standard opens, travels to a lot of these events. So let's go ahead and really quick take a look at our Season 1 schedule as we wind down the schedule here. We have a couple events left before the Invitational. We were in Louisville last weekend. We're here in Philly for the Legacy Open. Next weekend, we're in Indy, in March 19th to the 20th, we're in Indy for a Standard Open. We'll be in Baltimore April 9th through 10th for another Standard Open. And then we'll be in Columbus.
Crowning a champion.
April 15th through 17th. Standard, Modern, split format, Invitational. 4 people are going to punch their tickets for the Players' Championship. The winner, along with the 3 points leaders.
Yeah, a star-studded lineup.
So let's go ahead and jump back to our game so we can see what's going on. We've got Sam and Andy. So it looks like Sam has a Chalice of the Void. So he did bring in the Chalices.
So he did bring that in.
So he Chalice on 1. He does have an Ornithopter, Vault of Whispers. He's casting Arcbound Ravager. Sam just has a Flooded Strand, and that's it.
So Chalice on 1 is a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm a little surprised that Andy brought it in, but not immensely surprised. He might have even taken out some of his 1-mana casting cost things like Signal Pest and Springleaf Drum.
Yeah, Signal Pest and Springleaf Drum are the only 1-mana spells.
Yeah.
So, if he's bringing in the Chalices, those are some, I don't want to say they're low-impact cards, but they're not at their best against Miracles.
For sure.
I could very easily see those cards getting cut.
The other thing, too, is because Miracles has access to so many sweepers, Andy may be in a situation where he wants to pace his threats a little bit more and not commit so many to the board. So making it so that he doesn't have as many threats that are weak on their own is a reasonable idea.
So Andy's going to go ahead and send in the team here. He does have a Vault Scourge, Arcbound Ravager, and an Ornithopter. He's going to sacrifice a Vault of Whispers to the Arcbound Ravager, get in for 3 points of damage. And now it's interesting to note here that Ravager is much worse in this deck than in the Modern Affinity deck, in my opinion, just because there are no creature lands. So you do have the artifact lands that will allow you to power up the Arcbound Ravager, but you don't have something like Inkmoth or Blinkmoth Nexus to put the counters on to try and protect yourself from sweepers.
Yeah, that's true. That said, though, Andy Ferguson had a good play last turn where he attacked with his Ornithopter. Attacking with an O2 usually doesn't seem like a particularly good idea, but if Sam Roukas had tried to kill the Arcbound Ravager inside of combat, Andy would have been able to move those counters onto the Ornithopter and still push that damage through.
So Andy's gone in and just played another Vault Scourge here. He's sending in his Ornithopter, the Ravager, and the Vault Scourge, but he's going to go ahead and sacrifice the Ornithopter to the Ravager, bringing it up to a 4/4. Or to a 3/3 to get in 4 points of damage that turn. Sam just has another land and is going to go ahead and pass the turn back. Looks like he has a bunch of Terminus in his hand. It's not really where you want him. You want him on top of your library so you can draw them and miracle them. But he also has a Red Elemental Blast, so it looks like he heard what you were saying, and he decided to bring him in just in case Andy happens to have Tezzeret.
Seems like he also has Brainstorm too, so I certainly understand Andy committing a lot to the board because he wants to get the game over with quickly. The way that he wins is by getting ahead on the board fast. And with that Chalice, Sam is locked out of manipulating his library. So Sam is basically looking to naturally top deck a Terminus at some point.
So Andy's gone ahead and just played another Arcbound Ravager here. Going to fall to 12 in the process with activations from those Ancient Tombs. But he does have Sam on the back ropes.
Yeah, and Andy really doesn't care about taking damage at this point. He's just looking to push damage.
So he's going to attack here. 2 Vault Scourges and an Arcbound Ravager. He's going to cash in a Vault of Whispers, bringing his Ravager up to a 4/4. That's going to give us 6 points of damage. Sam's going to try that Brainstorm just to keep Andy honest with his Chalice of the Void trigger, which he did. And the players are going to go ahead and go back to sideboard. And I have to imagine here that Andy might potentially take some of those Chalices out, since they're not going to be as effective on the draw as they were on the play.
Yeah, that's true that they won't be as effective on the draw, but it certainly looked really good that game. And we can also see how from game 1, if Sam is able to cast his cards and bring things into the mid and late game, Andy Ferguson's deck may not be particularly well equipped. So Andy may just want to risk it anyway and say, well, I've just got to get a little bit of disruption, jam all my threats, and essentially just hope it's good enough. Because if you go into the long game, the Miracles player is just going to have more powerful cards, more card advantage, and has a lot of answers to shut Andy down.
Yeah, Affinity is going to need to get this game over nice and quick.
Affinity is good at that, though, so
that's
that part's
true.
good.
That's true. Cranial Plating is quite the magic card.
Yeah, that's sort of what Affinity is known for, is getting the game over with quickly.
Now, Cranial Plating and the Affinity mechanic was kind of a shadow over Mirrodin the first time we were there. And coming up here fairly soon, we have some more shadows.
Oh, yeah? What kind of shadows?
Shadows over Innistrad.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. Innistrad was an awesome limited format.
It definitely was. I liked it for Constructed as well, but we've got our pre-orders. They're going to be shipping on April the 8th. If you're interested, go.starcitygames.com/Shadows over Innistrad. As far as I know, with the actual storyline itself, Angels are going crazy. Jace is going in there to try and figure out what's going on. And the speculation is that it's Emrakul's fault.
Really? Wow, well, that's pretty cool.
So Emrakul wasn't on Zendikar with the other 2 Eldrazi Titans. He might be an Innistrad. Well, it might be an Innistrad. We don't know what gender Emrakul is. He has tentacles. It has tentacles. But I think that's going to be sweet.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this too. 2 of my favorite cards to play with, Olivia Valdarin and Huntmaster of the Fells, are both from that previous block. So I'm certainly looking for cards like that to be revisited, because they were a lot of fun to play with.
So we've got here Game 3, Sam Roukas on Miracles against Andy Ferguson on Affinity. Both players are 4-1. Sam's just going to lead on a Misty Rainforest and pass the turn back to Andy, who has... Oh, so we've got... we got a Force of Will.
This time it gets the Force.
So Andy had Mox Opal, Ancient Den,
a lot of stuff.
Mem Knight, which is going to give him 2 mana to play Chalice of the Void on 1, and Sam had a Force of Will.
Yep.
Which isn't the worst thing for Andy, since now he has some mana freed up. Now it looks like he does have an Ancient Tomb, which he could play a turn 2 Tezzeret if that Ancient Den didn't only produce white mana.
Yeah.
But he does have 4 mana that he can use to cast spells here on this turn. He's just going to attack for 1 with his Mem Knight.
Hopefully he can actually use all of his mana.
So Andy's going to drop to 18 from his Ancient Tomb. He's going to play, an Etch Champion. And then he's going to cast a Thought Cast.
Wow, this is a great turn. So you can see in this situation, Andy's deck acting a little bit like an engine. So on the one hand, a lot of his cards are probably not worth whole cards. Mem Knight, for example, you probably wouldn't value that as a whole card in Legacy. But you can see how he's getting ahead on mana and then is able to leverage that to also get ahead on cards, which is a pretty sweet thing that is typically one of the hallmarks of a powerful deck.
All right, so Andy's going to go ahead and use his fetches here. Now, it looked like he had another, he had a Terminus in his hand, so maybe he has another Brainstorm. He's going to go ahead and Brainstorm and put the Terminus back on top so that he can handle this Etch Champion. Or maybe he's just going to wait a few turns to try and get some more value.
Yeah, it may also be that he was just digging for land drops or something like that.
He did not have more lands in his hand, so he missed on his draw step. He does have a Ponder, so he's going to be able to look at the top 3, 2 of which are lands, so that's good news for Sam Roukas.
Yeah. So the thing about the Affinity deck is right now he has done a lot of fancy stuff, but he still doesn't have that much pressure. Without Cranial Plating or Arcbound Ravager, the Affinity deck doesn't usually do a whole lot of damage. A lot of its creatures are a little on the low impact side of things. So Sam right now has a little bit of time to set up a Terminus, maybe get a lot of value. Another sideboard card that I think I see in Andy Ferguson's hand is the Aethersworn Canoness. So it looks like he has boarded in a lot more disruption than I thought he would.
Yeah, Canonist is an interesting choice. Obviously good against Monastery Mentor, limiting the number of lands they can play, but this Tezzeret is going to be real good if it happens to resolve. Sam's going to go ahead and use a Brainstorm in response, trying to find a Force of Will, and he didn't, but he did find a Council's Judgment, which will give him an answer to that Tezzeret.
Not until it gets an activation, though. Tezzeret's a pretty sweet card. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's a card that doesn't see a whole lot of play, but it is essentially the artifact Planeswalker.
So I think he's just going to go ahead and +1, which is going to let him find a card off the top of his deck.
Yep, kind of like an impulse.
Now on Sam's turn, he is going to have to use that Council's Judgment to get rid of it, but he did stack the top 2 cards of his deck so that Terminus is 1 down. So Terminus is going to be looming for the turn after next.
So long as Sam Roukas has another land that he can play, it looks like he's going to be able to not only Terminus and wipe the board, but then Council's Judgment to kill the Tezzeret, which is really what he wants to do. Andy Ferguson has been playing multiple spells a turn, and Sam Roukas needs to play multiple spells a turn to catch up.
So looks like Andy is resolving his Tezzeret activation. He's going to take a Springleaf Drum.
Not particularly powerful.
No, but it is something that he can cast that turn, which is potentially going to help out for a Tezzeret ultimate if it happens. But Council's Judgment's going to take care of it. And let's see if Andy Ferguson has another copy of Tezzeret, because that would be very good for him.
Yeah, and it looks like he had a 4th land, but it wasn't a land that produced white. And so the line of play to Terminus and Council's Judgment wasn't available.
Yeah, so he stacked the top of his deck Jace Terminus, so he's going to Terminus next turn.
Yep.
The shields are down, though, if Andy happens to have something like Cranial Plating here.
Yeah, this is going to be a great moment for cranial plating. Andy Ferguson really wants to get a big hit in now while the coast is clear. Shields are down, he's got to make use of it.
So looks like the players are discussing something. So now that we've got everything sorted out, we're going to go ahead and go to Andy's turn. He's going to draw, it looks like, Seat of the Synod. So that's not going to be a threat, but he is going to be able to refill here.
So Andy was able to come out of the gate swinging. He cast multiple cards each turn, starting with turn 1. Sam has been slow to catch up. Sam has been predominantly making 1 powerful play per turn. But we're starting to get into the stage of the game where Sam Roukas is going to have enough mana to cast 2 cards a turn. Although this Either Sworn Canonist could have something to say about that.
Sam is going to go ahead and Terminus here on his turn, I have to imagine. There's another Springleaf Drum, so Andy has a lot of mana. It's like he has more lands in his hand, too. But Sam's going to go ahead and Miracle that Terminus.
And that was certainly the play that Sam needed. He needed to just clear the board.
He's going to not only Miracling the Terminus, but that's going to get rid of the Canonist, which will allow him to Snapcaster Major Ponder, shuffle his deck, get rid of some of the bad cards that he put back from the Brainstorm the previous turn, get a fresh card. And
that Either Sworn Canonist, it was actually set up to do quite a bit of work in that board state. Sam Roukas was at the point where he really needed to start casting multiple spells a turn to catch up. Fortunately, he had the 1 card that was an exception of that rule, which was Terminus. But if he didn't specifically have the Terminus, the Either Sworn Canonist would have done a lot to stymie his hopes of catching back up.
So it looks like Andy has another Canonist and a Vault Scourge. He's going to pass back to Sam, but Sam has Jace, just waiting to be deployed from his hand.
Yeah, Jace is a very powerful card.
He's going to go ahead and Brainstorm here. And he found a Swords to Plowshares and a Wear Tear.
Jeez.
And a fetch land to go get his red mana. So this is looking very, very good.
Dude, those are some sick top decks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Andy's going to go ahead and draw for his turn. Basically, we're at the point where we need to see a Tezzeret now.
Yeah. Now is even might be too late. So it's pretty interesting that Sam Roukas did bring in the blasts.
We're going to Brainstorm, go up even some more cards in our hand.
Wow, and does he have like an alpha or beta counterspell?
Yep, it looks like he just picked up a counterspell. Pass back to Andy. Andy's going to go ahead and attack Jace with his Vault Scourge. I think Sam's going to go ahead and plow the Vault Scourge on his end step. Uses Sensei's Divine Top. There's another copy of Jace.
When one Jace isn't enough, he's got the backup.
He's going to go ahead and brainstorm yet again. And there's a Monastery Mentor, so now he's going to be able to start applying some pressure here once he handles
and Monastery
threats.
Mentor is a great card for when you're starting to stabilize in the game, you can turn the corner very quickly, which is really important for these Miracles players who are worried about draws. A lot of times when you're playing a control deck, you'll be in a situation where you basically have the game locked up, but you have a hard time finding a win condition, or the win condition you have is really slow, aka a card like Nephalia Drownyard that we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
And so having a card like Monastery Mentor to just get things going and finish the game up in the next couple turns is a pretty nice thing when you're worried about draws.
So here Sam is just activating his Jace, brainstorming every turn. He's able to cast 2 spells because Divining Top is an artifact, and so Canonist lets you only cast 1 non-artifact spell each turn, and to get in for some damage, pass the turn back to Andy, and he's just going to go ahead and scoop it up.
Yep. Still, a 4-1 start for Andy Ferguson is pretty sweet. I mentioned before that if there were some people who were listening who didn't have a Legacy deck, but maybe have the Affinity deck for Modern, that this might be a good way to get into Legacy without having to buy a bunch of new cards.